The Appalachian Trail is an incredibly popular 2,200 mile long public hiking trail in the eastern United States that traverses scenic, wooded, pastoral, wild and culturally resonant lands. Since 1921, it claims to be the longest hiking trail in the world, and more than 3 million people hike segments of the trail each year. The Appalachian Trail has always been deemed as generally safe, with most dangers related to weather conditions, human error, plants, animals and diseases. One other danger on the Appalachian Trail Conservancy list is hostile humans. Since its completion in 1937, there have been 13 known murders on the trail, with the first murder reported in 1974. Today we're going to talk about case number 3, the murders of Susan Ramsay and Robert Mountford Jr. Before we get into today's story, World's End posts regularly to tell you some incredible and tragic tales of travelling around the world. If you want to see more, please like and subscribe so you don't miss out. Episode 3 is about 2 murders in 1981 that stunned the nation. High on the mountain, the sun has to fight its way down through thick forest. The light takes on a spectral elegance as if yellow diamonds are falling to the ground. The 2 campers loved so much about the mountain, how it gave to its visitors, how generous it seemed. There's another deer, listen to that owl, the trouts are running. But a murderer was in these woods too, and he brought darkness to the light. When Randall Lee Smith rose from a meal with Scott Johnson and Sean Farmer at their campsite along the Appalachian Trail, here in southwestern Virginia in May, he politely thanked them for the fried trout and beans, and he pulled out his .22 caliber pistol and calmly turned from one to the other. The first bullet hit Sean in the temple, the second hit Scott in the neck, the third hit Sean in the chest, and the fourth hit Scott in the back of the neck. Blood gushed against a moonless night. Scott had bolted into the woods, but the gunman was not finished. Sean had lumbered across the grass to his truck, parked a few yards away. When Randall reached him, he raised his gun again. 27 years earlier, in the spring of 1981, and a little more than a mile away, Susan Ramsay and Robert Mountford Jr. were both social workers from Maine. They were hiking the trail to raise funds for mental health causes. Robert left from Georgia and in early May met up with Susan in Virginia. At some point during the hike, they befriended another hiker who decided to join them on their mission. They said that they'd all initially meet up in Pearisburg to start their hike, but when Robert and Susan didn't turn up, the new hiker alerted the authorities as she became worried. When Robert's son-in-law heard about his disappearance, he got in his car and drove from Maine, stating, "Bobby's too good of a woodsman to get lost." Investigators took the report seriously and started to investigate their disappearances. The main investigator was Tom Lawson, who was a deputy sheriff for Giles County at the time. He gathered a team and he went to the trail to find Robert and Susan. They started questioning the hikers on the trail for any information they could give. Strangely, one hiker said they actually saw both of them with a strange-looking man near the Wapati shelter, which was a small log cabin that had only recently been built at the time. When Tom asked the hiker the man's name, they said a lying Randall. Tom brushed this off initially, thinking the hiker was some nutcase, and moved on. The investigators moved further down the trail in an effort to reach more hikers. They ended up at a trail near Pearisburg, where they bumped into 2 hikers who said they recalled seeing Robert and Susan with a third male near the Wapati shelter. Tom said they had acted very eerily. On the 20th of May, 11 days after the last sighting of the couple, Tom decided the next logical step was to go visit the Wapati shelter themselves and look for clues of their whereabouts. They looked around and nothing looked out of the ordinary. They thought it was probably about time to leave when they noticed something between the floorboards. They said it was a thick substance between the boards, so Tom ran his knife between them and saw evidence of coagulated blood. They needed to tear the floorboards up to see properly, and surely enough, there was a large amount of blood under the floorboards. Now with their panic in overdrive, they searched the whole site around the Wapati shelter, looking for any evidence that might help them find Robert and Susan. They paused as they come upon a small open area with a mound of leaves. The mound wasn't a natural looking occurrence and looked clearly man-made, as if someone tried to cover something up. They didn't need to dig for long before they saw what looked like a sleeping bag with something inside. Unfortunately, inside was the body of Susan Ramsay. The next day, with a full murder investigation underway, they decided to bring in the K9 team to try and find any evidence of the whereabouts of Robert. The dog was directed around the Wapati shelter for several hundred yards, where eventually the dog sniffed, paused and sat down. It was next to a tree stump. They didn't have much experience with the cadaver dogs. They first thought something like the dog was tired, but the handler assured them that the dog had found something. They start digging at the stump only 100 yards away from the Wapati shelter, and sure enough, they find another sleeping bag with something inside. Sadly, this also contained the body of Robert, and finally gave them the evidence to turn this search into a double murder investigation. Tom said Robert and Susan had been sharing an evening meal the night of their murder. They said it was likely a special occasion, as they'd had a very large meal and drank Bacardi rum, not something you'd typically ingest before a large hike the next day. It sounds like they were having the time of their lives before a monster decided to end their lives. Investigators discovered that Robert had a single .22 caliber gunshot wound to the head that was the cause of his death. Susan had it even worse. She had multiple defensive wounds on her hands where she'd fought for her life. She had blunt force trauma to the head, which investigators said came from being hit with a piece of iron. As well as this, she had puncture wounds from 2 different weapons. 13 of these wounds were from a coffin nail, and the rest were from a knife. Why Susan was killed in such a painful and horrific way compared to Robert is baffling. After the pair had been murdered, they were dragged from the shelter to their respective resting places. Investigators did find Susan's camera in the cabin, but unfortunately the film had been ripped out. In a stroke of luck, they found a paperback book which had the only clue they had to date: bloody fingerprints. They ran the fingerprints through the database and came back with one match: a shipyard worker called Randall Smith. Investigators immediately sent out an APB and closed the Virginia portion of the Appalachian Trail to hikers. Investigators went to Randall's home to try and find him and look for evidence that will link him to the murders. Strangely enough, they found blood-soaked jeans and some of Robert and Susan's belongings. There were also pornographic materials and hospital instruments which he had fashioned into sex toys. They said he probably acquired these instruments from the hospital where his mother worked. Finally, they found a note that was in Randall's handwriting which said he had been kidnapped by 2 people and he was going to be killed. Investigators didn't believe a word of it. More days passed with no sign of Randall, and investigators started to wonder if Randall had committed suicide. Tom needed a break from the investigation and took his family on vacation to Myrtle Beach in June 1981. Shortly after he arrived though, he was called by authorities in Giles County looking for him. They had arrested a man who they said could be Randall Smith, and they had, strangely enough, found this man in Giles County where Tom was vacationing. Tom immediately hurried to the station to have a look at the suspect, but en route he was told he was claiming to have amnesia and could not remember who or where he was. Once he got there, he saw a haggard man covered in insect bites, and he knew in his gut that this man was Randall Smith. They hatched a plan. They told Randall that some of the insect bites were quite serious, and if he didn't get medical attention immediately, they'd get much worse. The detained man nodded furiously. He didn't want to agree, but he'd already scratched some of the bites so much that they were bloody and raw. They told the man to get medical attention he'd have to sign a consent form. As soon as the form was placed in front of the man, he scratched a name: Randall Lee Smith. They had him dead to rights. So who was Randall Smith, and why did he commit such a horrific crime? Randall Smith was an only child from Perrysburg, a town of 2,700 people. He and his mother, Loretta Smith, lived alone and kept to themselves according to the residents. Most of them didn't even know the house was occupied. The house consisted of 4 small rooms and a basement. Loretta worked at Giles Memorial Hospital in the laundry room, who dressed her son in girls' clothing from an early age and never explained why, which at the time was incredibly abnormal. In high school, Randall was a loner who made a few friends, and on weekends he would walk parts of the Appalachian Trail which he could see from the window of his home. He reportedly never had a girlfriend and never attended parties with other classmates. One thing people did say about Randall though is that he was a habitual liar. He told lies about the money he and his mother had, stating that he had multiple other properties even though the house they lived in was modest to say the least. After high school, Randall Smith did odd jobs, including a brief stint in the Norfolk shipyards. The unsteady work left him free to roam, and he often hiked up and down the Appalachian Trail. He had long, dark hair, and his body was fleshy like a football player who'd given up training. Sometimes Smith vanished for days. Having never played sports or joined a scout troop or done anything with the community, no one seemed to have missed him. Back to the time of the crime, and Randall was being prosecuted by Hezekiah Osborne, who was the attorney for Giles County. He was being prosecuted for 2 counts of murder. They wanted to also prosecute for rape, but due to the condition of the body, couldn't prove this due to lack of evidence. Randall's lawyer offered a plea deal where he would plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, which would give him 30 years in prison, but no death sentence. Both the Ramsay and Mountford families agreed to the plea deal, which in turn led the prosecutor to agree. They agreed as they didn't want to give him the death penalty, but also didn't ever want to see him get out of prison, which in my opinion is so incredibly kind and brave by the families. They were struck by his background, and the Mountford family said, "I don't want it to sound like I sympathise with him. After all, he was a murderer, but he never really did have a life, and what life he did have, he made up." Even though the plea deal created massive controversy, resulting in protests and outrage, they accepted the plea deal and Randall went to prison. Randall only served 15 years in prison before being paroled in 1996, where he'd been a model inmate who never caused any problems. Randall soon started hiking parts of the Appalachian Trail again, and eventually, after his mother passed away, packed up all of his belongings and left for the trail with his backpack, dog, and .22 revolver. The story doesn't end here, but it will continue in a later episode in this series. So that is the incredibly sad story of the murders of Susan Ramsay and Robert Mountford Jr. Susan and Robert must have been such caring and kind people to hike the trail for such a good cause, only to run into a monster. I was going to do one video on the Appalachian Trail murders, but from the very first case, I decided the stories needed telling in their entirety. This is why I've decided to make a series on this. Please feel free to subscribe. I will put all the videos in a playlist for you to watch in the series and for you to binge to your heart's content. If you like this video, please leave a like and a comment. It's completely free and helps more than you think. Lastly, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.